Now to that breaking news. Singer David pleads not guilty inside a downtown LA courtroom.
On September 8, 2025, David was living what should have been one of the biggest moments of his career. At just 20 years old, he had gone from making music in his bedroom to becoming one of the fastest rising artists in the industry. His songs had amassed billions of streams, his debut album had launched successfully, and his first headline tour was drawing packed crowds across North America. That night, thousands of fans filled a venue in Minneapolis to see him perform. As the lights dimmed, the audience erupted. David walked onto the stage smiling, feeding off the energy of the crowd as fans sang every lyric back to him. Throughout the night, he joked with the audience, handed out gifts, and looked exactly like a young artist enjoying the biggest breakthrough of his life. To everyone inside that venue, it was just another incredible concert. More than 2,000 miles away, however, another group of people was about to uncover something far more disturbing. Earlier that day, police in Los Angeles had been called to investigate an abandoned Tesla Model X. The vehicle had reportedly been sitting unattended for several days before it was eventually towed to an impound lot. At first, it appeared to be nothing more than another abandoned luxury vehicle. Then, employees noticed a powerful odor coming from the car. By the time investigators arrived, the smell had become impossible to ignore. Officers began searching the vehicle. When they opened the front trunk, they found plastic bags containing dismembered human remains. The discovery immediately transformed the scene into a homicide investigation. Because of the condition of the remains, identifying the victim wasn't easy. Investigators worked for hours before finally determining who they were looking at. The victim was Celeste Rivas Hernandez, a teenage girl who had been reported missing nearly 17 months earlier. For her family, the search was over. For detectives, the investigation was only beginning. The next question was obvious. Who owned the Tesla? When investigators traced the registration, they found the name that shocked almost everyone following the case. The vehicle belonged to David. At first glance, the connection made very little sense. David had built his public image around emotional music, not violence. He had no widely known criminal history, rarely attracted controversy, and was viewed by fans as a quiet, reserved musician who had achieved overnight success through talent and persistence. Nothing about his public persona suggested he would become connected to one of the most disturbing criminal investigations of the year. Yet, while detectives photographed evidence inside an impound lot in Los Angeles, David was still on stage. The concert ended. The following night, he performed again. To fans, everything appeared completely normal. Nobody in those audiences knew what investigators had allegedly connected to him only hours earlier. But once news of the discovery became public, everything changed. Within days, people began revisiting years of David's online presence. Old live streams resurfaced. Archived Discord conversations began circulating. Deleted social media posts reappeared. Fans started listening to his lyrics again, this time through a completely different lens. Almost overnight, the conversation shifted from celebrating one of music's fastest rising stars to asking whether warning signs had been hiding in plain sight all along. As investigators quietly continued building their case, David's career began unraveling. Major brands distanced themselves. Tour dates disappeared from the schedule. Industry partnerships came to an abrupt end. The momentum that had taken years to build seemed to collapse in a matter of days. But despite the growing public attention, one question remained unanswered. How did one of the industry's fastest rising young artists become connected to a murder investigation involving a missing teenage girl? To answer that question, investigators would have to go back several years, long before the abandoned Tesla, long before the homicide investigation, to the beginning of David's rise to fame, and a relationship prosecutors allege had been hidden from public view almost from the very start. Long before his name became associated with one of the most disturbing criminal investigations in recent memory, David was simply another teenager with an internet connection and a dream. Like millions of young people, he spent countless hours online, playing video games, hanging out on Discord, and building friendships through communities that existed almost entirely in the digital world. Music wasn't even supposed to be his career. In fact, David originally gained attention through gaming content, particularly Fortnite, where he built a small but loyal online following. At the time, nothing suggested he would eventually become one of the fastest rising artists in the music industry. Then, everything changed almost overnight. In 2022, David released Romantic Homicide. The song exploded. What started as another bedroom recording quickly became one of the biggest viral songs of the year, accumulating hundreds of millions of streams before eventually reaching into the billions across platforms. Suddenly, record labels wanted him. Streaming platforms promoted him. Fans around the world connected with his emotionally raw lyrics and minimalist production. The quiet teenager making music from his bedroom had become an international artist almost overnight. As his popularity grew, so did the image surrounding him. Unlike many young celebrities, David didn't present himself as loud or attention-seeking. He appeared reserved, soft-spoken, almost awkward during interviews. That authenticity became part of his appeal. Fans saw someone who didn't seem manufactured by the music industry. Instead, he looked like someone who had accidentally become famous. But behind the success, another side of David's music was beginning to attract attention. Many of his songs revolved around obsession, fear of abandonment, possessiveness, and relationships that spiraled into violence. At the time, almost nobody questioned it. Dark themes have always existed in music. Artists write about heartbreak, jealousy, death, fantasy. None of those subjects automatically reflect who someone is as a person. So listeners treated David's lyrics the same way they treated thousands of other artists who explored disturbing emotions through music. As fiction, as storytelling, as art. His breakthrough single itself carried a title that, in hindsight, many people would later revisit: Romantic Homicide. Initially, fans interpreted it exactly as intended, a metaphor for the emotional destruction caused by a failed relationship. No one imagined that only a few years later, those same lyrics would be examined by millions of people searching for clues. By 2023, David's career had accelerated even further. His music appeared in television shows. Major brands partnered with him. He collaborated with some of the biggest creators on the internet. Every new release expanded his audience, and his debut album positioned him as one of the industry's most promising young artists. On the surface, everything pointed toward a long and successful career. But prosecutors now allege that, while David's public life was taking off, his private life was becoming increasingly complicated. According to investigators, years before the public ever heard the name Celeste Rivas Hernandez, David had already met her through online communities centered around Fortnite and Discord. Court documents allege their first contact occurred in early 2022, when Celeste was still a child. What allegedly began as online conversations would eventually develop into a relationship prosecutors describe as increasingly secretive and controlling. None of this was visible to the public. Fans continued streaming his music, buying concert tickets, celebrating every milestone in his career. Meanwhile, investigators now believe an entirely different story was unfolding behind closed doors, one that would remain hidden until a missing persons investigation forced authorities to begin connecting the pieces. And by the time those pieces finally came together, it was already far too late. According to prosecutors, the story didn't begin in 2025. It began years earlier. Investigators allege that David first met Celeste Rivas Hernandez in early 2022 through online gaming communities, including Fortnite and Discord. At the time, David's music career was beginning to gain momentum. Celeste, meanwhile, was still a child. Prosecutors allege that what started as online conversations gradually developed into a relationship that became increasingly personal over time. Court records state that detectives believe the two remained in regular contact for years, communicating through Discord, text messages, and other online platforms. As David's popularity continued to grow, their relationship allegedly became more private. Former acquaintances who later spoke to investigators claimed they had seen Celeste around David's online communities long before anyone outside those circles knew who she was. Some alleged that people close to David were already aware of the relationship. Those claims remain part of the broader investigation, but they would later become an important focus for prosecutors attempting to establish a timeline. Publicly, however, David's career couldn't have looked more different. Every new release brought more listeners. Every interview introduced him to a larger audience. His fan base continued growing, and very little attention was being paid to what investigators now allege was happening behind the scenes. Then, in February 2024, everything changed. Celeste disappeared. Her family began posting missing person flyers across social media, desperately asking anyone with information to come forward. They described her as a 13-year-old girl who had vanished from Lake Elsinore, California. Days turned into weeks, weeks turned into months. For her family, every passing day meant fewer answers. As investigators retraced Celeste's final known movements, one name repeatedly appeared in their investigation: David. According to court documents, detectives contacted him during the missing person investigation. David reportedly told investigators that he barely knew Celeste and claimed he had only met her once. He also reportedly stated that he didn't know she was underage, but prosecutors argue that explanation quickly began falling apart. According to court filings, during that same interaction, David allegedly showed investigators a yearbook photograph of Celeste. Prosecutors later argued that possessing the photo contradicted his claim that he barely knew her or was unaware of her age. At that stage, however, investigators didn't have enough evidence to arrest him, nor did they have enough evidence to prove where Celeste was. Then, only days later, Celeste returned home. For a brief moment, it appeared the missing person case might finally be over, but prosecutors allege it wasn't. Instead, they claim David continued contacting her almost immediately. According to court filings, after Celeste's parents confiscated her phone, David allegedly drove to Lake Elsinore and paid another middle school student approximately $1,000 to secretly provide Celeste with a replacement phone. Prosecutors argue the purpose was simple: to continue communicating without her family's knowledge. If true, investigators say it demonstrated a level of planning that went far beyond casual contact. While all of this was allegedly happening, David's public life continued moving in the opposite direction. His career reached new heights. New opportunities appeared almost weekly. Fans celebrated every success without knowing prosecutors would later allege that an entirely different story was unfolding behind the scenes. By 2025, investigators claimed the relationship had become increasingly unstable. Court documents describe frequent arguments involving jealousy, control, and Celeste wanting something different for her future. One message cited by prosecutors allegedly came from Celeste herself: "All we do is have sex and hang out. Man, I want more than that for myself." To prosecutors, messages like this suggested the relationship was beginning to break down. They allege Celeste wanted independence. David, they argue, did not want to lose control of the relationship. According to investigators, tensions escalated even further when Celeste allegedly threatened to expose the relationship publicly. If those allegations were accurate, prosecutors believe the timing couldn't have been worse for David. His debut album was gaining momentum. Major brand partnerships had begun. His career was reaching a level he had spent years trying to achieve. Prosecutors argue that public exposure of an alleged relationship with a minor could have destroyed everything he had built. Whether that ultimately became the motive remains a question for the courtroom. But investigators believe their relationship had now reached a breaking point. And according to prosecutors, only days later, Celeste got into an Uber that would become the final confirmed journey of her life. According to prosecutors, the events that followed unfolded over the course of a single night. Court records allege that on April 23, 2025, David arranged for an Uber to pick Celeste up from her family's home. Records cited by investigators reportedly show that she arrived at his residence at approximately 10:10 p.m. From there, the prosecution argues, the timeline becomes increasingly suspicious. According to court filings, roughly 20 minutes after prosecutors say Celeste had already arrived at the property, David began sending her text messages asking where she was. Investigators believe those messages weren't genuine. Instead, prosecutors allege they were deliberately sent to create the impression that Celeste had never made it to the house at all. If that allegation is true, they argue it marked the beginning of an attempt to establish a false timeline. What happened next is based on the prosecution's version of events. According to investigators, Celeste was stabbed multiple times, suffering wounds to her chest and abdomen that ultimately caused fatal blood loss. From that point forward, prosecutors allege David's actions became increasingly calculated. Investigators claim he drove through Santa Barbara in an attempt to dispose of evidence before purchasing a series of items they believe were intended to help conceal the crime. Among those purchases, prosecutors say, were chainsaws, heavy-duty trash bags, a body bag, a shovel, and an inflatable blue pool. According to investigators, the pool was allegedly intended to contain blood, while the body was dismembered inside the garage. But prosecutors argued that the cleanup didn't go as planned. Rather than eliminating evidence, investigators say the process created even more of it. According to court filings, biological material spread throughout the garage during the alleged dismemberment. Investigators also claim the inflatable pool was damaged in the process, leaving behind small blue plastic fragments. Months later, detectives reportedly recovered matching fragments both inside the garage and among Celeste's remains. Prosecutors argue the similarities became another piece of physical evidence connecting the crime scene to the body. Investigators also allege the cleanup itself was surprisingly incomplete. According to prosecutors, David never fully removed biological evidence from the garage. The damaged inflatable pool was still reportedly inside the property when detectives later executed a search warrant. And perhaps most surprising of all, authorities allege the remains were never permanently disposed of. Instead, prosecutors claim they remained inside the front trunk of David's Tesla for months. Investigators believe air fresheners had been placed inside the vehicle in an apparent attempt to mask the odor of decomposition. Eventually, rather than destroying the vehicle altogether, prosecutors allege it was simply abandoned. That abandoned Tesla would later become the single most important piece of physical evidence in the investigation. But the forensic evidence didn't stop there. According to investigators, searches of David's digital accounts uncovered an enormous amount of electronic evidence. Authorities reportedly seized approximately 40 terabytes of digital data during the investigation. Court filings allege that investigators recovered messages, photographs, videos, and other electronic records connected to the relationship between David and Celeste. Some of that material, prosecutors allege, became central to the criminal charges that would later be filed against him. The medical examiner's findings added another disturbing layer to the investigation. According to reports, Celeste died from multiple stab wounds that resulted in catastrophic blood loss. Her body had been dismembered. Investigators also noted that 2 fingers were missing. Online observers quickly connected that detail to reports that Celeste had a tattoo associated with David on one of those fingers. Prosecutors later suggested the missing fingers may have been an attempt to remove identifying features connected to the relationship. The toxicology report generated additional questions. While decomposition can complicate postmortem testing, preliminary screenings reportedly detected substances that investigators examined as part of the case. To date, however, no definitive public conclusion has established exactly what role, if any, those findings played in Celeste's death. As detectives continued piecing together the evidence, the investigation expanded beyond David himself. Authorities began examining communications with people around him, looking into whether anyone else may have had knowledge of the alleged relationship or assisted after the crime. Some investigators publicly speculated that moving and dismembering a body alone would have been extremely difficult. However, no additional person has been convicted in connection with those allegations, and many of those claims remain unproven in court. Meanwhile, investigators continued building what prosecutors described as an extensive case. Months after the alleged murder, and months after the abandoned Tesla was finally searched, David was arrested. He was charged with first-degree murder, along with multiple additional felony charges related to the case. David has pleaded not guilty, and the criminal proceedings remain ongoing. But by the time the arrest was announced, the story had already spread far beyond the courtroom. The investigation had become a global internet phenomenon. Millions of people weren't just following the evidence, they were searching through David's past, convinced that the warning signs had been there all along. By the time David was arrested, the criminal investigation wasn't limited to detectives anymore. Millions of people had begun conducting investigations of their own. Across Reddit, X, TikTok, YouTube, and Discord, users started digging through years of David's online history. Old live streams resurfaced, Archived Discord messages were shared, deleted social media posts reappeared. Even interviews that had once gone largely unnoticed were suddenly being viewed millions of times. But one topic dominated the conversation more than any other: his music. Listeners returned to songs they had heard hundreds of times before, searching for lyrics that might take on an entirely different meaning after the allegations became public. His breakout hit, Romantic Homicide, quickly became the center of that discussion. The title alone attracted enormous attention. People began dissecting individual lyrics, comparing them to details from the investigation, and asking whether they reflected real life or simply fictional storytelling. Others pointed to earlier songs that explored themes of obsession, abandonment, jealousy, and violence within relationships. Some listeners argued those songs now sounded disturbingly literal. Others pushed back, pointing out that artists have written about murder, heartbreak, revenge, and death for decades without committing violent crimes themselves. The debate quickly expanded beyond music. Fans revisited David's music videos. One video in particular drew significant attention because of imagery involving candles, a seemingly lifeless woman, and visuals that some viewers believed resembled hiding a body. Investigators have never publicly stated that these artistic choices were evidence of criminal intent. Instead, much of that discussion developed online, where theories spread rapidly as millions of people attempted to connect details that may or may not have been related. The same happened with David's first headline tour. After the allegations became public, fans noticed the stage design featured funeral imagery, including a coffin, white flowers, memorial decorations, and the guest book where attendees were invited to leave messages. Before the investigation, most people viewed it as part of the album's stark artistic aesthetic. Afterward, many interpreted it very differently. Whether those interpretations hold any legal significance is another matter entirely. Courtrooms rely on evidence. The internet often relies on patterns. Sometimes those two overlap. Sometimes they don't. That distinction became increasingly important as speculation spread faster than verified information. While online communities debated lyrics, symbolism, and old videos, prosecutors continued focusing on something much simpler: physical evidence, digital records, witnesses, and the timeline they believe connects them all. Those not internet theories will ultimately determine what happens next, because while millions of people have already reached their own conclusions, only one courtroom will decide whether prosecutors have proved their case beyond a reasonable doubt. Today, David faces some of the most serious criminal charges under California law. Prosecutors have charged him with first-degree murder, along with several additional felony charges, including the alleged murder of a witness, murder for financial gain, lewd acts involving a minor, and the mutilation of human remains. If convicted on all counts, he could spend the rest of his life in prison. David has pleaded not guilty, and his defense team has denied the allegations against him. Like every criminal defendant, he is presumed innocent unless and until proven guilty in court. As of now, the legal process is still unfolding. A jury, not the internet, will ultimately decide whether the prosecution has proven its case beyond a reasonable doubt. Regardless of how the trial ends, this case has already left a lasting impact. For Celeste Rivas Hernandez's family, it represents the devastating loss of a daughter whose disappearance remained a mystery for more than a year. For David's fans, it has forced an uncomfortable question. How well do we really know the people we follow online? Social media allows us to see carefully curated moments. Music gives us a glimpse into an artist's emotions. Interviews reveal selected pieces of a personality. But none of those things tell us everything about the person behind the screen. Perhaps that's one reason this case has captured so much public attention. It isn't just about a criminal investigation. It's about the collision between internet fame and reality. A young artist who appeared to have everything, a teenage girl whose life was cut tragically short, and a case that transformed from a missing persons investigation into one of the most closely watched criminal prosecutions in recent memory. In the months and potentially years ahead, new evidence will almost certainly emerge. Witnesses may testify, arguments will be challenged, claims will be scrutinized. Only then will the full story be tested inside a courtroom. Until that happens, one fact remains undeniable. A young girl lost her life. A promising music career came to an abrupt end, And the case that began with an abandoned Tesla has become one of the most disturbing intersections of fame, social media, and alleged violence in recent memory. The internet may have already reached its verdict. Now, the courtroom will decide the rest.